Now, in the middle of this war in which the British government has again obstructed attempts to get a call for an immediate ceasefire, there was instead a different form of words. The Prime Minister tonight called for a complete reappraisal of the way in which the so-called war on terror is being fought. Although it's now clear that many of those closest to the Prime Minister are frustrated and depressed at his personal blocking of calls for a ceasefire, he said what was needed was a renaissance of strategy. Is this a new approach or an attempt to paper over deep divisions in Cabinet? Michael Crick reports.
In Los Angeles today, a big job offer for when Tony Blair steps down. From the Hollywood hard man turned Governor of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
I get him to play Terminator 4. I mean, anything is available.
Now, that is definitely the best offer I've had. Actually, the sad thing is it's the only offer I've had.
Mr. Blair has been steadfast behind George Bush over the Middle East, in effect backing Israel in its fight to terminate Hezbollah. But tonight, in what Downing Street trailed as a major policy speech, Mr. Blair urged a complete renaissance in Middle East strategy in the light of the Lebanon crisis.
My argument to you today is this. We will not win the battle against this global extremism unless we win it at the level of values as much as force, unless we show we are even-handed, fair and just in our application of those values to this world. Unless we reappraise our strategy, unless we revitalise the broader global agenda on poverty, climate change, trade, and in respect of the Middle East, bend every sinew of our will to making peace between Israel and Palestine, we will not win. And this is a battle we must win.
Talk of fairness and renaissance, but nothing substantially new, and probably not enough to reassure Labour MPs increasingly worried about Mr. Blair's strong support for Israel, including many who backed him on Iraq.
I supported the Iraq war and I continue to support it. This is much wider. I think there's a big difference between the situation of Israel, Lebanon and Palestine from the situation in Iraq. And most of us feel that there has to be a political resolution of the Israeli-Palestine conflict and that Britain and the EU should be being much more robust in making sure that settlement happens and much more robust in pointing out to Israel that it is acting in defiance of international law.
More significant politically, about a third of the cabinet, it now seems, also have serious misgivings about the Blair line, including several on whom the PM can normally rely.
Without access to the real cabinet table, Newsnight, in its own inimitable way, borrowed a BBC News conference room to illustrate the growing problems around Tony Blair's cabinet table. Perhaps the most telling intervention at their meeting last Thursday came from David Miliband, the former head of Mr. Blair's policy unit. Mr. Miliband expressed sympathy with Israel, but said, "Where's all this going to end?" And two other Tony Blair loyalists also expressed their concerns. Hilary Benn, the Development Secretary, and Lord Grocott, the Chief Whip in the House of Lords. And it's reported that at least one other minister passed a note along the table to the Prime Minister, warning him not to assume that their silence meant consent. Now, these voices of dissent in Cabinet last Thursday come on top of other expressions of concern over recent days. The former Foreign Secretary Jack Straw has come under some criticism for not speaking out himself last Thursday, but then, over the weekend, he told Muslims in Blackburn that Israel's attacks had been disproportionate. Israel, he said, had caused death and misery to innocent civilians. Others in Cabinet thought to have concerns include Peter Hain and also the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott.
Part of Tony Blair's problem now is a reflection of the weakness of his internal position. With Iraq, there should have been a major cabinet revolt over the policy or the non-policy, but apart from Robin Cook's resignation and Claire Short's belated resignation, they all rolled over. This time they are being, if only largely in private, more critical of his position. I would simply say this: if you stand by collective cabinet responsibility, there's no point in privately making excuses. You are as equally culpable as anybody else.
What's fascinating is the stance of Margaret Beckett. With EU foreign ministers today, she had to back Blair, blocking calls for an immediate ceasefire in favour of the slightly milder immediate cessation of hostilities. But the BBC understands that earlier, Foreign Office officials acting on Mrs Beckett's behalf strenuously tried to get Number 10 to press America to get Israel to cease its military campaign. Rebuffed, the Foreign Office urged at least a suspension of US flights supplying munitions to Israel. When that failed too, British diplomats got Washington to route future such flights through military bases. This isn't the first time we've seen serious differences between the British Foreign Office, normally seen as pro-Arab, and Downing Street. And some former ambassadors to Arab states may jointly urge Mr Blair to change tack, as they did before, unsuccessfully of course, on Iraq.
I do think it's time to put some ideas to the Prime Minister, whether it's done through a petition of ambassadors or ex-ambassadors or in some other way, because I think that specifically on the question of the ceasefire, this insistence by President Bush and the Prime Minister that we shouldn't work for an immediate ceasefire strikes me as completely Alice in Wonderland. I heard Margaret Beckett on the radio trying to defend it, and clearly she'd been given a good brief by her officials and she stuck to it, bless her, but it wasn't convincing. It was totally unconvincing. You can't make peace without having a ceasefire.
The one thing Tony Blair has on his side is the summer holiday. With most MPs away and no cabinet for several weeks, opposition won't be anything like as strong as it might be.
And Nick Robinson, the BBC's political editor, is with the Prime Minister in Los Angeles. Nick, it was a very confident performance. He didn't seem like an embattled individual, but did he give any indication of what mechanisms he had in mind for promoting values?
No, none at all, frankly, Jeremy. And those of us who remember that dramatic speech he made after 9/11 will recall that he said very similar things. The kaleidoscope, you may recall, he said had been shaken, we must reshape the world. And he included saying that the people of Gaza needed a Palestinian state. I think what has changed, though, is that Tony Blair is spending the credits he's got in the American bank, if you like. He stood shoulder to shoulder, not just on Iraq and Afghanistan, but here on the issue of Israel and Lebanon as well. And he's now saying to an American audience, you guys really do have to win hearts and minds and not just bomb people to win the war on terror. And critically, that means committing yourself over a sustained period of time to creating a Palestinian state.
Is there any sign they're listening?
The only sign is this, that George Bush has committed himself to a two-state solution, and at his news conference on Friday, he did keep referring, in a phrase that wouldn't have passed the lips of most American presidents in the past, to a Palestinian state. But is there any activity? Well, not really, nothing visible. And frankly, Jeremy, lots of people listening to this will say it's a bit much to talk about building peace with the Palestinians at the very moment that Israel is at war in Lebanon and there's no sign of that war actually stopping.
Nick?
So the Prime Minister made no concession to people about that war in Lebanon tonight at all. He's talking about a new peace down the track.
Nick, thank you.